So picture a dirt road near the Dardanelles.
Okay.
It is the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia.
Right.
The year is 1922, September, and the air is just thick with dust and tension. On one side of this road, you have this heavily fortified line of British Imperial troops. Their artillery is locked and loaded.
Completely entrenched.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And on the other side, slowly emerging through all that dust, are 2,000 Turkish cavalrymen. But the thing is, they aren't charging.
Right. They're not attacking.
No, they are walking their horses at this deliberate, agonizingly slow pace. And their rifles. The barrels are pointed straight down at the dirt.
Wow.
Yeah. And in the pocket of the British commander, General Charles Harrington, is a direct codified order from London. It says, if the Turkish forces do not halt and turn around within 24 hours, open fire.
Which is just a massive escalation.
It is. So we are looking at a standoff with exactly 75 minutes left on the clock.
Yeah.
75 minutes until the British Empire triggers a conflict that would likely spiral into, well, basically a full continuation of World War I. I mean, the psychological pressure on that dirt road is, well, it's almost unimaginable.
Oh, absolutely.
You have an empire that is completely detached from reality, just screaming for war from thousands of miles away.
Yeah.
And then you have a local commander staring into the eyes of an army that had just spent 3 years fighting for its absolute survival.
Right.
Harrington's finger is literally hovering over a button that could rewrite the entire 20th century.
It's wild. And that moment at Senecal, which is known as the Chinnak crisis, is the explosive climax of a story that is so wildly misunderstood.
It really is.
When we look back at the conflict that birthed the modern Republic of Turkey, between 1919 and 1922, the history books usually label it the Greco-Turkish War.
Right, that's what everyone calls it.
Exactly. The maps show Greece colored in one shade, Turkey in another, and we just assume it was this straightforward binary conflict. Two nations fighting over borders.
Which is, I mean, a huge oversimplification. It's a complete illusion. Because when you bypass those textbook summaries and actually dig into the source material, the diplomatic cables, the financial ledgers, the intelligence reports of the era, the map is basically a lie.
Yeah, completely.
In almost every practical, financial, and strategic sense, the documents show this was a Turkish-British war.
And it serves as the ultimate unfiltered blueprint for imperial outsourcing.
Yes, exactly.
Because this period exposes the mechanics of how a superpower attempts to dictate the fate of millions of people, carve up continents, and achieve these massive geopolitical aims, all without sacrificing its own citizens.
Right.
I mean, it really is the birth of the modern proxy war.
And that is the mission for this deep dive. If you are listening to this and wondering how global superpowers actually pull the strings in conflicts happening today, you need to understand what the sources tell us about Anatolia a century ago. We are going to deconstruct the elaborate diplomatic theater, the financial suffocations, and the weaponization of international law that allowed Britain to fight a war while pretending to be, a neutral bystander.
A completely innocent observer.
Exactly. But to understand how we got to that 75-minute countdown at Chinnak, we really have to rewind. We have to look at the audition phase.
Or setup, right?
Yeah, how did Greece become the chosen instrument of the British Empire? And the sources show the setup for this begins long before the first shot of the Greco-Turkish War is even fired. It actually starts in 1914.
Right. So the momentum truly begins with Eleftherios Venizelos. He was the Greek prime minister at the outset of World War I.
Okay.
And while the Greek monarch, King Constantine, was determined to keep his nation neutral, Venizelos saw this golden geopolitical opportunity. He was an ardent believer in what they called the Megali idea.
The great idea. Let's break that down for the listener. Because the Megali idea wasn't just some vague patriotic slogan.
Yeah.
Based on the text, what did that actually look like on a map?
Well, it was a wildly ambitious, expansionist, nationalist ideology. The goal was to essentially resurrect the borders of the Byzantine Empire.
Wow, so going way back.
Yeah, we are talking about incorporating the western coast of Anatolia, Thrace, and ultimately the grand prize, Constantinople, into a greater Greece.
That is massive.
It is. And Venizelos knew he couldn't achieve this alone. He needed the backing of the Entente powers, the major wartime alliance of Britain, France, and Russia.
Right.
So in the summer of 1914, before the Ottoman Empire had even formally entered World War I against the Entente, Venizelos was already making overtures.
He was already planning ahead.
Exactly. The internal British War Cabinet documents reveal that Winston Churchill was drawing up plans to force the Straits and occupy Istanbul, relying entirely on the prospect of a Greek proxy army to execute the ground assault.
Consider the sheer audacity of that. You have a British cabinet minister drafting military operations utilizing the army of a sovereign, neutral nation.
Yeah, it's pretty bold.
But the sources show Venizelos wasn't just offering hypothetical support. He was so fiercely committed to this alliance that he fractured his own country.
Literally tore it apart.
Yet when King Constantine refused to abandon neutrality, Venizelos didn't just resign. He actually went to Crete and the Aegean Islands, rallied generals from the recent Balkan Wars, and actively recruited a volunteer army.
He set up a rival government.
Exactly, a rebel government in Thessaloniki, explicitly to join the war alongside the British and French.
And the domestic toll of that decision is just staggering. This period is known as the National Schism. Venizelos intentionally split his nation in half just to secure a seat at the imperial negotiating table.
Right.
By 1916, this breakaway government had provided 23,000 Greek volunteers, actively serving under British and French command.
That's a huge number.
And by late 1916, 3 entire regiments of this Venizelist army were taking direct orders from British officers.
So they were essentially integrated into the British military apparatus. Eventually, the pressure campaign works. Constantine is forced into exile in 1917, and Greece officially joins the war.
Right.
And by the fall of 1918, as the Allied armies advance toward Istanbul under the command of General Milne, the vanguard consists of 3 British regiments, 1 French regiment, and 3 heavily armed Greek regiments.
And those Greek troops are carrying brand new weaponry.
Yes, financed and supplied directly by London and Paris.
Which brings us to the defining moment where Greece transitions from a wartime ally to the ultimate post-war proxy enforcer.
The audition.
Exactly. The year is 1919. World War I is officially over, but the region around the Black Sea is in absolute chaos due to the fallout of the Russian Revolution.
Total mess.
The French and British are deployed in places like Ukraine and Crimea, trying to contain the Bolsheviks, the radical Marxist faction that had seized control of Russia.
And the texts indicate the French military is experiencing a complete systemic breakdown here.
Yeah, it's a disaster.
The accounts from historians analyzing the French deployments in cities like Odessa describe a situation teetering on full-blown anarchy. The French soldiers who have just survived the meat grinder of the Western Front are suddenly told they have to fight a new ideological war in the freezing mud of Ukraine.
They're just done.
Yeah, they begin to mutiny. They are refusing orders. They are pinning red cockades, these small ribbons, signaling communist sympathy to their uniforms.
Wow.
They are circulating subversive pamphlets. The French command realizes they have completely lost control of their own men.
And the desperation in the French High Command is palpable. On April 6, 1919, Paris issues a frantic evacuation order. They abandon Odessa, practically handing Crimea to the advancing Soviet forces.
Right.
But the logistics of a panicked evacuation are incredibly dangerous, especially with a mutinous crew. So who provides the rear guard?
The Greek troops.
Exactly.
And this detail is the ultimate proof of concept for the British. During that chaotic retreat from Odessa, the Greek battalions remained impeccably disciplined.
They didn't break.
No, they didn't fracture. They didn't mutiny. In fact, the naval records show that every single French transport ship trying to leave the Black Sea had to be shadowed by a Greek naval vessel.
That's incredible.
The Greek guns were literally trained on the French ships, acting as a deterrent, just in case the French sailors decided to overthrow their own officers mid-voyage.
It functions as the perfect audition. Greece proved to the exhausted imperial powers that they were a reliable, disciplined force willing to do the dirty work that British and French citizens would no longer tolerate.
Yeah, they stepped right up.
And the geopolitical reward for this loyalty was imminent. We move to the Paris Peace Conference, where the victors are carving up the map of the fallen Ottoman Empire.
This is where the backroom dealing gets incredibly cutthroat. Italy, which was one of the victorious Allied powers, feels they're being shortchanged.
Right, they had expectations.
They had a secret agreement from 1917 promising them significant territorial spoils in Anatolia, specifically the major port city of Izmir. In an attempt to force the issue, Italian troops start marching north from Marmaris and Kusadasi, attempting what diplomats call a fait accompli.
Just taking it.
Yeah, taking the territory by force so that the other powers just have to accept it as an accomplished fact.
And the prospect of Italy controlling the most vital port on the Aegean coast terrified the British. They viewed Italy as a potential rival for Mediterranean dominance.
Right.
So Prime Minister Lloyd George, heavily supported by U.S. President Woodrow Wilson and French Prime Minister Clemenceau, executes this rapid, devastating countermove.
Okay, what do?
They authorize the Greek army to land at Izmir and occupy the city to block the Italians.
Now, on the surface, it looks like a defensive maneuver to manage a rogue ally, right?
Sure, yeah.
But the archival evidence reveals a much darker, calculated strategy at play here. Professor Arnold Toynbee, who was a highly influential British historian deeply embedded in the intelligence and diplomatic networks of the era, he outlined the brutal mathematical logic behind this deployment.
And Toynbee's analysis is shockingly cynical. The British objective was to impose a punitive, crippling peace treaty on the remnants of the Ottoman Empire, effectively subjugating the Turkish population.
Right.
However, Britain completely lacked the ground forces to impose this reality. Back home, the British public was exhausted.
They had just finished a massive war.
Exactly. They were facing massive labor strikes that threatened domestic stability, and a brutal war of independence was escalating in Ireland. The idea of shipping tens of thousands of British soldiers to fight a new insurgency in Anatolia was politically suicidal.
So Toynbee looks at the map and sees this perfect lock-and-key mechanism. Greece could supply the bodies for the land war.
Right.
If Britain provided the Royal Navy, the endless lines of credit, and the diplomatic community, Greece would march into Anatolia. But here is the truly sinister part of Toynbee's calculation as laid out in the texts.
What's that?
He points out that Greece is a maritime nation, a labyrinth of islands and peninsulas, as he calls it. His argument is that if the Greek army manages to completely dominate the Turkish interior, Britain will inherently dominate Greece.
Because of the Navy.
Exactly, because the British Royal Navy can blockade and choke off the Greek islands at a moment's notice. Greece acts as the jailer for Turkey, and Britain holds the keys to Greece's cell.
Oh.
Greece becomes nothing more than the Mediterranean fortress of British imperialism.
And the scale of Britain's post-war ambitions really required this exact kind of ruthless outsourcing.
Yeah, they had big plans.
The British imperial design wasn't just about punishing Turkey, it was about securing an unbroken chain of hegemony. They wanted to control the Caucasus, the oil fields of Mosul, Turkestan, Iran, Afghanistan, and the highly strategic straits.
That is a massive footprint.
It really is. They envisioned a massive geopolitical firewall against the Soviet Union, composed of heavily managed buffer states, Armenian, Georgian, Kurdish, and Pontic enclaves. Greece was the muscle hired to clear the ground for this architecture.
I have to ask, though, looking at the sheer ambition of Venizelos, was Britain purely manipulating a naive Greek state? Or was Venizelos expertly playing Lloyd George to finance his own Byzantine fantasy?
Right, who is using whom?
Yeah, exactly.
The historical reality presented in the sources is a deeply parasitic symbiosis. Venizelos was exceptionally opportunistic.
Okay.
We have access to a dispatch he sent to Athens in March 1920 detailing a closed-door meeting with the British War Secretary. And the British are remarkably blunt.
What did they say?
They tell Venizelos, we have no troops to send you. If you want this territory, you have to pacify it with your own military. We will only garrison Istanbul and the Straits.
Wow.
And Venizelos accepts without hesitation. He tells them his army will handle the interior.
So he is actively volunteering his citizens' blood to purchase British diplomatic backing.
Exactly.
And the sources show he even doubles down a few months later. In June 1920, British forces find themselves pinned down by Turkish nationalist fighters at Izmit. Venizelos reaches out to London and offers to send an entire Greek division to rescue the British soldiers. He explicitly asks for zero Allied military assistance in return.
He wants to prove his worth.
Yeah, he wants to prove on a bloody stage that his army is the only force capable of crushing Mustafa Kemal's emerging nationalist movement.
And the financial compensation for this proxy service was astronomical.
Oh, yeah.
The Treasury records indicate that between 1914 and 1920, direct British financial aid to Greece exceeded £16 million sterling.
Which back then was
Adjusted for inflation, that is a staggering infusion of military capital.
insane.
Furthermore, the supposed separation between the two militaries was a complete illusion. Entire Greek divisions stationed in the Kocaeli Peninsula were acting on the direct tactical orders of British commanders.
So there was no real independence.
None. The Greek Navy wasn't operating independently either. It was being advised and steered by a formal British naval mission headed by Admiral Kelly. The operational intertwining was absolute.
This brings us to a phase of the conflict that exposes the absolute comedy of international law when it is manipulated by an empire.
Oh, yeah.
Because once the Greek proxy army was fully equipped, positioned, and unleashed, the British couldn't simply sit in the audience and watch. They had to actively choreograph the devastation.
They had to manage their investment.
Right. This leads to the joint military operations and the weaponization of the concept of neutrality.
So we enter the summer of 1920. The Greek army launches a massive offensive into the Anatolian interior on June 22.
Okay.
The public narrative is that this is a sovereign Greek military action, but the internal planning documents tell a completely different story. The strategic blueprint for this entire offensive was drawn up jointly with the British Black Sea Army Command.
And the coordination wasn't just on paper in some back room. It was explosive and it was highly visible.
Very much so.
When the Greek forces moved to occupy towns along the Marmara Sea, places like Mudanya and Gemlik, these were explicit combined arms operations.
Right.
British dreadnoughts would pull up to the coast and unleash devastating artillery barrages to clear the Turkish defenses. And then the Greek infantry would disembark under that protective umbrella to occupy the burning towns.
There is a particularly harrowing anecdote recorded by Toynbee that strips away any illusion of British non-involvement.
Yeah, this one is rough.
Toynbee travels to a Turkish village called Ömer Bey. He speaks with the survivors and uncovers a horrific sequence of events.
What did he find?
Well, a British naval detachment had arrived at the village prior to the offensive. Under the guise of maintaining regional order, the British troops systematically went house to house, confiscating every single firearm and defensive weapon the villagers possessed.
Wow.
And as soon as the village was completely disarmed, the British packed up and left.
And then days later, the advancing Greek forces sweep into the area and overrun the completely defenseless village. The surviving villagers tell Toynbee directly, if they had known the British were simply disarming them to serve them up to the Greek army, they would have fought the British soldiers to the death from the very beginning.
They were betrayed.
Yeah, the British used the authority of their uniform to neutralize the opposition for their proxy.
And the mechanics of how imperialism operates often rely on these grotesque perversions of procedure, maintaining a veneer of protocol while basically facilitating slaughter.
Right.
And this reliance on legal fictions becomes even more pronounced when the military reality on the ground begins to shift against them.
The turning point.
Yeah. In March 1921, the Turkish nationalist forces, organized under Mustafa Kemal, achieve a stunning victory against the Greek army at the Second Battle of Innu.
Okay.
This sends a shockwave through London. Suddenly, the British military establishment looks at their massive investment and realizes their proxy might actually lose this war.
The panic sets in. So what is the British response to their proxy failing? They suddenly discover the virtues of pacifism.
Oh, how convenient.
Right. They declare strict neutrality. They draw an arbitrary line on the map around the Straits in the Marmara Sea and declare it a neutral zone.
But scrutinize how that neutrality functioned in practice, according to the texts. It was a weaponized legal barrier.
Exactly.
The declaration of the neutral zone only restricted the movement of the Turkish forces. It was an invisible, legally enforced wall erected solely to protect the British garrisons and the Greek supply lines from Turkish counterattacks.
And the hypocrisy of this neutrality is almost tough to comprehend. While London is preaching non-interference to the international press, the Greek Navy is actively using the British-controlled waters of Istanbul and the Marmara Islands as forward operating bases.
Just blatantly using them?
Yes, massive Greek warships, vessels like the Kilkis, the Panther, and the Avarov are dropping anchor in supposedly neutral British waters.
Right.
And from these safe havens, they are launching brutal blockade operations against the Turkish coast.
The operational logs of those warships are damning. On July 19th and 20th, the Greek warship Panther sails out of its neutral anchorage and bombards the Turkish coastal city of Trabzon.
Wow.
2 days later, they bombard Sinop. They are actively hunting down and capturing Turkish civilian supply vessels, ships like the Gulsamal and the Ümit.
Unbelievable.
And when the Ottoman authorities in Istanbul file frantic protests against this blatant violation of international law, the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Curzon, formally replies, defending Greece's right to conduct offensive military operations from neutral waters.
Let that sink in. The architect of British foreign policy argues that neutrality means one side can use your ports to bomb the other side's cities.
It's completely absurd.
And the economic manipulation is just as insidious. There was an international arms trade agreement in place, specifically designed to prevent neutral nations from fueling active war zones by selling weapons to combatants.
Right, a standard embargo.
So how does Britain bypass a treaty they themselves championed?
Through the quiet, untraceable mechanics of the financial sector.
Of course.
The British Foreign Office issues discrete directives to their chambers of commerce. They inform the major arms manufacturers that, despite the international treaty, His Majesty's government sees no legal obstacle to fulfilling weapons contracts for the Greek state.
A quiet nod and a wink.
Exactly. Simultaneously, the Bank of England is instructed to continuously extend vast lines of credit to Athens, ensuring they have the liquidity to purchase those weapons.
It operates exactly like a modern corporate shell game. On paper, the British government's hands are clean. In reality, the British General Staff is sitting in London running complex logistical algorithms.
Yeah, very calculated.
The sources show they calculate exactly how many days it would take for Soviet aid to travel from the Caucasus over the mountains to the Kemalist forces in Ankara. They figured out it was a 62-day march.
Very precise.
Right. They then hand that intelligence to the Greek High Command, advising them on the exact window of time they have to launch a killing blow before the Turkish resistance can be resupplied.
Observe how deeply this resonates with modern geopolitical conflicts. When a superpower declares neutrality today, or offers a legal justification for a regional blockade, you have to ignore the press release and look at the logistics.
Look at the money.
Exactly. Who has access to the airspace? Who is underwriting the sovereign debt? The British playbook of weaponized neutrality in 1921 demonstrates how a superpower can asphyxiate an opponent while hiding behind the shield of international law.
But despite this overwhelming, multidimensional assault, military, financial, and diplomatic, the Turkish resistance was not breaking.
No, they held
The
on.
Greek army was pushing deeper and deeper into the harsh Anatolian interior, reaching the banks of the Sakarya River. But the Kemalist forces refused to shatter. They were fighting an existential war of survival.
Right.
The British intelligence apparatus realizes that a purely military victory might be impossible. They need a different kind of weapon.
They need sabotage.
Exactly. They decide they have to dismantle the Turkish resistance from the inside. They need political sabotage.
Which means we enter the darkest, most Byzantine phase of British plotting, spanning 1921 to 1922.
Okay.
The atmosphere in London shifts from imperial arrogance to palpable panic. By June 1921, Winston Churchill, who was serving as the colonial secretary, is terrified.
Really?
Yeah, he sends a frantic, highly confidential letter to Prime Minister Lloyd George. He explicitly warns that the British Empire is careening toward a catastrophic, humiliating defeat at the hands of a Turkish nationalist army they had completely underestimated.
Wow.
Churchill argues that such a defeat will shatter British prestige across the entire Islamic world.
And Churchill's proposed solution is incredibly telling. The text shows he doesn't suggest peace. He suggests stripping away the illusion of the proxy entirely.
Right, taking off the mask.
He tells Lloyd George they need to force the Greeks to submit to total British control, reorganize the entire Greek army under direct British command, put General Harrington in charge, and hold a hard defensive line at Izmir and Çanakkale.
He basically wants to fire the middle manager and the hostile takeover himself.
Exactly.
But the Foreign Office, steered by Lord Curzon, prefers a more insidious methodology.
Okay, what's their plan?
Well, a seminal policy document from February 6, 1922, exposes their multi-pronged strategy to strangle Mustafa Kemal.
Okay, break it down.
Step 1. Enforce an absolute watertight financial and economic blockade of Anatolia.
Standard.
Step 2. Threaten to strip Turkey of previous diplomatic concessions, including their presence in Thrace and Istanbul.
Okay.
But the true venom was in steps 3 and 4. Actively fracture the Turkish political establishment.
How do they do that?
They plan to sign a separate peace treaty directly with the captive Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul, while simultaneously financing and fostering opposition factions within Mustafa Kemal's own parliament in Ankara.
So they were actively hunting for a Trojan horse.
Exactly.
British intelligence agents were intensely monitoring figures like Rauf Orbey, who was a prominent Turkish leader commanding an opposition faction within the Grand National Assembly in Ankara. The British analysis noted that Orbey's faction was exhausted by the relentless warfare. The British desperately hoped that this group might be willing to compromise on the fundamental text of the Turkish resistance, the National Pact, or Misak-ı Milli.
Right. If they could elevate Orbey, he could push a peace agenda from within the parliament.
And effectively overthrow Kemal through political fatigue.
Exactly. And to execute this internal coup, the British relied heavily on a man named Mr. Ryan, the chief dragoman at the British embassy.
Now, the role of a dragoman is fascinating. Can we explain that?
Yeah, originally they were simply official translators, bridging the linguistic gap between Western diplomats and the Ottoman court.
Right.
But over centuries of the capitulations, the unequal treaties forced upon the Ottomans, the dragomans evolved into immensely powerful shadow ambassadors.
Wow.
They possessed deep cultural knowledge, vast networks of informants, and the ability to dictate policy directly to Ottoman officials.
So Ryan wasn't just observing the situation, he was stage managing it. The documents show that in February 1922, Ryan literally drafts a script for the Ottoman Sultan to read.
He wrote his lines.
Yes, the scheme was elegant in its deceit. The Allies would publicly offer a seemingly reasonable peace treaty to the Sultan's government in Istanbul.
Okay.
The Sultan, following Ryan's script, would sign it and then broadcast a grand proclamation to the nation. The proclamation would beg the Turkish people to accept the peace, end the bloodshed, and abandon the Kemalist extremists in Ankara who were prolonging the war.
And the British High Commissioner, Sir Horace Rumbold, was the primary champion of this plot. He convinced London that the Anatolian peasantry was secretly desperate to turn on Mustafa Kemal, and that a single authoritative signal from the Sultan, acting as caliph, would trigger a massive anti-Kemalist uprising.
And the Sultan, the Detan, was more than a willing participant here.
Very much so.
In a highly sensitive meeting with Rumbold in August 1922, the sources state the Sultan explicitly begged the British to provide his personal forces with modern weaponry and asked the British Royal Navy to actively assist him in clearing out the nationalist rebels.
Think about that.
The nominal ruler of the empire was asking a foreign occupying power to help him slaughter his own people.
But if you want to understand just how desperate the geopolitical calculus became in London, you have to look at their backup plan.
Oh boy.
Because while they were trying to prop up the Sultan and manipulate the Ankara parliament, British intelligence began exploring an alternative that defies all conventional logic.
Okay, what is it?
They started considering backing Enver Pasha to topple Mustafa Kemal.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Why would the British, who just spent all of World War I fighting the Ottoman leadership, suddenly think backing a notorious figure like Enver Pasha was a good idea? Isn't that the definition of a desperate geopolitical gamble?
The Enver Pasha pivot is perhaps the most glaring example of imperial hypocrisy on record. Enver Pasha was the former Ottoman Minister of War. He was the architect of the Ottoman Empire's alliance with Germany. He was the man who had ordered the guns to fire on British troops at Gallipoli.
Right, a massive enemy.
The British establishment considered him an unredeemable war criminal. Furthermore, after the war, Enver had fled to Moscow and was collaborating with the Soviets, leading the British to classify him as a highly dangerous Bolshevik agent.
So why on earth would the British Empire, who had just sacrificed millions of men to defeat Enver Pasha's armies, suddenly consider putting him back in power?
Because the logic of empire is entirely transactional. It is driven by the fundamental doctrine of divide and conquer.
Right.
The British had realized a terrifying truth about Mustafa Kemal. He was immune to compromise on the core issue of sovereignty.
He wouldn't bend.
No. Kemal's national pact demanded absolute political, financial, legal, and military independence within defined national borders. He could not be bought, bribed, or intimidated into accepting a subservient state. Enver Pasha, however, had recently relocated to Central Asia and had opportunistically turned against his Bolshevik sponsors, leading a rebellion there.
So, the enemy of my enemy, even if he was my sworn enemy 5 minutes ago, is suddenly my friend.
Precisely. British intelligence produced reports analyzing the ideological friction between the Kemalists and the Enverists operating in Anatolia.
Okay.
They acknowledged that Enver was erratic and dangerous, but they concluded that a fractured, chaotic Turkey fighting a civil war between Kemal and Enver was infinitely preferable to a unified, impenetrable Turkey led by Kemal.
They just wanted chaos.
Yeah, if Enver could shatter the nationalist front, Britain would happily deal with the fallout later.
And if the Dragoman script failed, and Enver Pasha failed, the texts show the British and Greeks had yet another architectural contingency. Yeah.
The
creation of the Ionia state.
Right, the backup plan.
If you can't conquer a country, just invent a new one.
The Ionia State project was an astroturfing campaign on a geopolitical scale. The plan was to permanently amputate Western Anatolia and create a brand new, supposedly autonomous but entirely subservient Christian state.
Oh.
They veiled this raw land grab in the language of humanitarianism, claiming it was necessary to protect the local Greek Orthodox populations.
Okay.
They established a National Defense League, began arming civilian militias to terrorize the local Muslim population, and drafted logistical plans for a 100,000-strong proxy army garrisoned in major Turkish cities like Bursa, Bandırma, Soma, and Manisa.
This wasn't a fringe conspiracy theory drafted by a rogue intelligence officer either.
No, not at all.
The British Prime Minister Lloyd George stood up in the House of Commons on August 4th, 1922, and publicly endorsed the concept.
He gave it public backing.
Yeah, he argued that the Greek army had a moral obligation not to abandon the Christian minorities, laying the political groundwork for international recognition of this phantom state.
Right.
General Harrington, commanding the British forces in Istanbul, was a massive proponent of the Ionia state. He recognized that a compliant proxy government controlling the southern coastline of the Dardanelles would permanently secure British naval access to the Black Sea without requiring a single British soldier to hold the line.
It is the ultimate expression of imperial arrogance. To look at a map of a sovereign nation and casually decide to erase its borders and install a bespoke government simply to ease your naval logistics.
But the arrogance collided violently with reality in the late summer of 1922.
It all came crashing down.
All the meticulously crafted plots, the dragoman's whispered scripts, the secret weapons shipments to the Sultan, the cynical gamble on Enver Pasha, the blueprints for the Ionia state, all of it disintegrated in a matter of days.
Because on August 26th, Mustafa Kemal unleashed the Great Offensive.
Exactly.
And the sudden assertion of sheer military force shatters the entire diplomatic facade. The Greek front lines, which had been static for months, completely collapse under the coordinated assault of the Turkish Nationalist Army.
The rout is absolute. The Greek army doesn't just retreat, it disintegrates.
Total collapse.
Within 2 weeks, the proxy army that Britain had spent years and millions of pounds building is driven hundreds of miles, culminating in a chaotic, desperate evacuation into the Aegean Sea at Izmir.
The proxy is dead.
The buffer is gone, the illusion of distance evaporates, and suddenly the British Empire is left standing, completely exposed, face to face with the victorious Turkish cavalry.
Which brings us back to that dirt road, the Çanak crisis.
Right.
With the Greek forces eliminated, the Turkish army pivoting north toward the Straits poses an existential threat to the British position. The Turkish vanguard approaches the borders of the British neutral zone at Senegal.
And the diplomatic confusion in those first few days is incredibly revealing in the sources. Sir Harry Lamb, the British consul in Izmir, manages to secure a meeting with Mustafa Kemal.
Okay.
Lamb, representing the might of the British Empire, asks Kemal point blank, "Are you declaring war on Great Britain?"
A direct question.
And Kemal delivers a response that is a masterclass in legal and strategic precision. He informs the consul that the government in Ankara hasn't yet established formal diplomatic relations with London, making a declaration of war impossible.
Brilliant.
Furthermore, he points out a glaring historical fact. The war that began in 1914 never actually concluded.
Kemal is exploiting the very legal loopholes the British love to use.
Right.
The Armistice of Mudros, signed in 1918, was a ceasefire, not a final peace treaty. A permanent settlement had never been ratified by the legitimate representatives of the Turkish people.
So technically.
Therefore, from the perspective of international law, the defensive war against the invading imperial powers was simply ongoing. Kemal flips the script, placing the burden of escalating the violence squarely on the British.
When this legal and military reality reaches London, the cabinet descends into absolute chaos.
They lose their minds.
It is September 1922. Churchill, realizing his geopolitical architecture is collapsing, completely loses his grip on reality. He begins referring to the situation as a necessary crusade against the Turks.
Wow.
He desperately searches for new proxies. He suggests bribing the Bulgarians, the Romanians, or the Serbs to invade Turkey.
Anyone to fight for them.
When those nations refuse to bleed for British interests, Churchill drafts an unhinged, panic-stricken telegram and blasts it out to the entire British Empire, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa.
Okay.
He begs the Dominions to immediately mobilize their armies and send their sons to fight the Turks at Çanak.
And the response to Churchill's telegram signals a fundamental shift in world history.
A huge shift.
The Dominions, who had sacrificed hundreds of thousands of men at places like Gallipoli and the Somme just a few years prior, look at this request to fight a new war over a minor strait in Turkey, and they categorically refuse.
Wow.
Only New Zealand, out of a sense of lingering imperial obligation, offers to send a small contingent of volunteers. Canada and Australia essentially tell London that the era of blind imperial obedience is over.
But the men sitting in Whitehall refuse to accept that their power is waning. On September 15th, the British cabinet drafts a public manifesto that reads like the ravings of a cornered beast.
Right.
They threaten to unleash the full, devastating might of the British military. They attempt to incite global panic, claiming that if Mustafa Kemal's forces cross the straits, it will trigger a catastrophic wave of violence across the entire Islamic world, a global holy war against European civilization.
So much fear-mongering.
They authorize the British Mediterranean fleet to use all necessary force to annihilate the Turkish advance.
They establish a powder keg, douse it in gasoline, and hand the match to the men on the ground. By late September, the British lines at Chanak are heavily fortified with artillery, machine gun nests, and naval bombardment coordinates locked in.
Right.
And then the Turkish cavalry arrives at the wire.
But they don't charge. The discipline of the Turkish forces in this specific moment is just staggering.
It really is.
2,000 cavalrymen slowly walk their horses right up to the British barricades. And as they walk, every single rider points the barrel of his rifle at the ground.
A clear signal?
It is an undeniable, highly coordinated visual signal. We are claiming this land. We are not intimidated by your guns, but we will not be the ones to fire the first shot. We are calling the bluff of the British Empire.
And it places the moral and historical responsibility for World War II squarely on the shoulders of the British commander, General Charles Harrington.
Because London is not bluffing.
No.
The cabinet formally grants Harrington the authority to issue a final ultimatum. If the Turkish troops do not evacuate the neutral zone within 24 hours, the British forces are ordered to open fire. The order is transmitted. The countdown begins.
This is where history hinges on the individual psychology of one man.
So what does this all mean for General Harrington? He literally ignored a direct order from London to start a war. Was he a rogue general or the only sane man in the room?
Well, Harrington receives the order. He looks at the cables demanding blood from politicians sitting comfortably in London. Then he looks through his binoculars at the Turkish soldiers standing in the dust, rifles lowered, completely unafraid. And Harrington disobeys the order.
Wow.
Evaluate the magnitude of that decision. A career military officer ignoring a direct, highly debated directive from the Prime Minister and the cabinet.
Right.
Harrington possessed the crucial perspective that Churchill lacked: reality. Harrington knew his forces were isolated and vulnerable. He recognized that initiating a firefight against a highly motivated, battle-hardened Turkey army would result in a massacre, regardless of the naval artillery at his back.
Yeah.
He realized that a war initiated over a fictional neutral zone would be impossible to justify or win. He chose the certainty of insubordination over the catastrophic probability of a global war.
He holds his fire. He refuses to issue the order to engage. And because Harrington creates that window of silence, the diplomats are able to frantically scramble and pull the world back from the brink.
It was so close.
An armistice is hastily negotiated and signed at the town of Mudanya. The timeline is terrifying. The signatures hit the paper with exactly 1 hour and 15 minutes remaining before Harrington's previously distributed operational orders to his artillery commanders would have become active.
The world was 75 minutes away from unimaginable carnage.
It's just wild to think about.
And the fallout from Chenak is immediate and devastating, but not on the battlefield. It destroys the British political establishment.
Really?
Yeah, the British public, the press, and the Conservative Party are absolutely appalled when they realize how close Lloyd George and Churchill brought them to the precipice of another global war, simply to salvage a failed proxy strategy in Anatolia.
They were furious.
The Conservative Party stages a revolt at the Carlton Club, the coalition government collapses, and Lloyd George is forced to resign, never to hold major political office again. The architects of the proxy war are destroyed by its failure.
Okay, so the military war was over. But the conflict didn't end. It merely changed venues.
Okay.
The battlefield shifted from the muddy trenches of Anatolia to the opulent, gilded negotiating halls of Switzerland. The transition from the sword to the pen brings us to the final phase. The Treaty of Lausanne, the bitter dispute over Mosul, and what we can call the anti-imperialist paradox.
So the Lausanne Conference, convened in late 1922 to finalize the peace, was a masterclass in diplomatic hostility.
Oh, I've heard about this.
Despite the undeniable reality that the Turkish army had decisively won the war on the ground, the British delegation, led by Lord Curzon, arrived determined to treat Turkey as a conquered, subservient vassal.
Of course.
Curzon adopted the persona of a punitive schoolmaster dealing with unruly children.
And the archival details of the conference expose the petty, calculated insults the British used to assert dominance.
Very petty.
They initially tried to manipulate the framing of the entire event, insisting on calling it the Near East Affairs Conference to avoid acknowledging it as a formal peace treaty with a sovereign equal.
Right.
But the most absurd manifestation of this arrogance was the furniture.
Oh, the chair incident.
Yes. When the delegations arrived for the opening sessions, the British organizers had specifically arranged for the representatives of the major European powers to sit in massive, ornate, plush armchairs.
Okay.
But for the Turkish delegation, representing the victorious nation, they provided small, standard wooden chairs.
It is a deliberate physical manifestation of imperial hierarchy, a visual cue to the international press that Turkey was not an equal.
Exactly.
But the chief Turkish negotiator, Ismet Pasha, immediately recognizes the trap. He walks into the room, looks at the wooden chair, and flatly refuses to sit down.
Good for him.
He halts the entire international conference until the British are forced to drag in a matching armchair. He demands literal and diplomatic parity.
But while Ismet Pasha won the Battle of the Chairs, the British utilized their overwhelming diplomatic leverage to secure their core strategic imperatives.
They still got what they wanted.
Yeah, they couldn't dictate the borders of Anatolia anymore, but they successfully forced through provisions that mandated the demilitarization of the Straits, ensuring the British Royal Navy maintained unimpeded access to the Black Sea.
Right.
And most significantly, they deliberately stalled the negotiations regarding the fate of Mosul.
Now, Mosul is the key to understanding the continuity of British imperial strategy. Mosul, located in northern Iraq, sat on massive, newly discovered oil reserves.
Oil, of course.
The region possessed a significant Turkish and Kurdish population, and the Ankara government claimed it as part of their national territory. The British, who had occupied the region just after the armistice in 1918, were absolutely determined to annex it into their newly created Mandate of Iraq.
So what did they do?
Unable to force a resolution at Lausanne, the British ensured the issue was deferred, moving the conflict into a new phase of diplomatic and covert warfare.
The physical fighting didn't actually stop in 1922. Let's look at 1924.
Oh.
While Turkish and British diplomats are sitting in Istanbul supposedly negotiating the Mosul border, the British military launches an unprovoked bombing campaign against the Hakkari region in southeastern Turkey.
Just blatantly bombing them.
Yeah, they aren't just dropping bombs, they're actively attempting to carve out yet another proxy state. They try to establish an estuary buffer, state arming and organizing the local Assyrian Christian population, known as an estuary, to rebel against Ankara and push the borders of British Iraq further north.
They never stopped trying.
No. The British command even issues a formal ultimatum demanding Turkish troops evacuate their own sovereign territory.
And when military intimidation fails, they pivot to institutional weaponization. In 1925, a massive internal revolt, the Sheikh Said Rebellion, erupts in eastern Turkey.
Right.
The British immediately seize the opportunity. They utilize their immense influence within the newly formed League of Nations to orchestrate a massive international propaganda campaign.
How so?
They taint the Turkish government's suppression of the rebellion as a targeted religious persecution of Christian minorities. They use the institutional framework of the League to stall negotiations, manipulate international sentiment, and isolate Turkey diplomatically.
Wow.
And the pressure campaign works perfectly. In 1926, the League of Nations formally awards the oil-rich province of Mosul to British-controlled Iraq. The proxy war evolved into an institutional war, and the empire secured its prize.
Analyzing the totality of this conflict reveals a profound strategic paradox at the heart of the Turkish national struggle. It is one of the most fascinating aspects of this entire history.
It really is.
The war for Turkish independence was, at its absolute core, a life-or-death struggle against British imperialism. The British funded the invading army, the British supplied the artillery shells, the British blockaded the ports, drafted the partition treaties, and actively plotted to assassinate the Turkish leadership. Yet, despite knowing all of this, Mustafa Kemal and the nationalist leadership deliberately, painstakingly fought this war while maintaining the fiction that they were not fighting the British Empire.
It requires a level of strategic discipline that is just breathtaking. It was a war of anti-imperialism executed with flawless, cold-blooded pragmatism.
Yeah.
The Kemalists constructed a rigid diplomatic firewall. They relentlessly promoted the public narrative that their sole enemy was the invading Greek proxy force and the corrupt, illegitimate officials surrounding the captive sultan.
They never formally declared war on Great Britain.
Never. They allowed British occupation forces to sit undisturbed in the cafes of Istanbul while tens of thousands of Turkish soldiers were dying fighting British-funded troops just a few hundred miles away in Anatolia.
It's like fighting the puppet but constantly assuring the puppeteer you have no problem with them, even though you both know exactly what's happening.
Yeah.
How did the Turkish public reconcile this? I mean, how did the Kemalist leadership justify this bizarre theater to a population enduring such immense suffering?
They justified it through the brutal math of survival. Mustafa Kemal understood the exact weight of the British Empire.
Okay.
He knew that if he officially declared war on London, or if nationalist forces initiated an unprovoked attack on the British garrisons in Istanbul, he would hand Winston Churchill the exact political justification he was desperate for. A direct attack would galvanize the exhausted British public. It would authorize the deployment of the Royal Navy dreadnoughts to level Turkish cities, the mobilization of the massive Indian army, and the implementation of a total suffocating blockade.
So they had to play the game.
Exactly. By obsessively focusing all military violence onto the Greek proxy, Kemal denied the empire the political capital required to unleash its full wrath. He calculated precisely how much he could bleed the proxy before the puppeteer was forced to intervene, and he stayed right on that line.
And there is no historical event from the sources that illustrates this surreal, paradoxical relationship better than the final departure of the British occupation forces from Istanbul in October 1923.
Oh, this story is amazing.
Right. The war is over. The proxy is defeated. The Republic is imminent. General Harrington is preparing to board a ship back to England. But he doesn't slip away in the night. He insists on organizing a massive formal military parade through the streets of the city he had occupied for years.
The obsession with maintaining the visual prestige of the empire remains intact until the very last second.
Yes.
And the historical accounts record a detail that borders on the absurd. The Turkish regiment assigned to participate in the handover ceremony did not have appropriate ceremonial footwear. So, to ensure the optics of the parade were flawless, the British military actually opened their quartermaster stores and issued brand new boots to the Turkish soldiers who were taking their city back.
It's just wild. And as the British guards marched toward the docks, stepping in perfect unison,
Right.
the reaction of the Turkish crowds is astonishing.
Right.
These are people who have endured years of occupation, starvation, and warfare orchestrated by the very men marching past them. Yet the crowds do not riot. They applaud.
They politely applaud the martial discipline of the departing British troops.
And the British, recognizing the profound strategic victory of their adversaries, reciprocate the gesture. As the British military band marches onto the transport ships, leaving Anatolia forever, they strike up a tune. They play a highly popular, triumphant Turkish march, Mustafa Kemal Pasha.
It is the perfect encapsulation of an era defined by smoke and mirrors. Two nations that had engaged in a brutal, multi-year war of annihilation through intermediaries, who had pushed each other to the absolute precipice of a global catastrophe on a dirt road at Chanak, concluding their conflict with polite applause and a musical tribute.
They maintained the diplomatic fiction until the ships disappeared over the horizon.
Yeah, they really did.
When we began this deep dive, the Greco-Turkish War appeared, as it does in the textbooks, a localized binary conflict over borders. But by pulling back the layers, we exposed the massive churning engine of imperial power operating just beneath the surface.
We saw the millions of pounds flowing from the Bank of England.
The naval barrages launched from neutral waters, the desperate plots of the dragomen, and the imperial hubris of men like Lloyd George and Churchill.
Right.
And we saw how all of that machinery was ultimately dismantled by the iron-willed pragmatism of a nationalist movement that understood exactly how to fight an empire, and a single British general who refused to push the button.
Because history is rarely a simple ledger of who shot whom. The value of examining the mechanics of 1920 is that it equips you to understand the world today.
Exactly.
Look at the conflicts dominating our modern news feeds today. When you see two nations locked in brutal combat on the ground, you have to look past the trenches. You have to ask the critical questions.
Who is providing the Navy?
Right. Who is guaranteeing the sovereign debt to keep the economy afloat? And who is sitting in an air-conditioned room thousands of miles away, treating the map of the world like a chessboard.
Yeah.
The names of the empires change, the technology evolves, and the legal loopholes adapt. But the fundamental playbook of the proxy war, the blueprint finalized in the ruins of the Ottoman Empire, is still actively in use.
The geopolitical X-ray machine might be broken, but the bones are still there, directing the movements if you know how to look for them. Keep questioning the map. We'll be back soon to unpack more hidden histories and explore the incredible, complex mechanisms that actually explain our world.